thank all of you for coming and giving of your time and attention. I've been chewing on this for some time, and I've prepared a rather lengthy um, presentation, um, and I'll try to move fairly quickly. But if at some points you need me to stop and back up, let me know. And Peter, I can't see anybody else on my screen other than you. So if you want to bring me to a screeching halt, please do that.
Okay.
So this is a meditation on the corruption of our character. And it's treated, if you like, as a first draft of a thesis with a hypothesis. And therefore, I would welcome particularly the kinds of comments that would point out where places I'm just plain wrong, or places where the argument needs to be strengthened or elements added to it, whatever. But I think that this has the potential in its own way to be as disruptive to Canada as climate change will be. This is a political disruption that I take very seriously. So let me set up this session. There's a disclaimer which simply says, these are my views. I want to be heard as saying, this is how I see and experience these people. This is how they appear to me. I don't know how they actually are. I don't know them. I would have to know them with in a way that I have no access to them to move beyond that. It was almost 2 years ago that I spoke to KCOR, warning them that an Alberta clipper was about to strike Eastern Canada late in the summer into fall of 2021.
Just to interrupt, KCOR is the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome.
Yes.
Go ahead.
And they have a weekly webinar. And so this is the time, I didn't know about the truckers thing then, but you'll remember that it was in the fall that they began to announce and plan their thing, and it was just after Christmas that they arrived here. And I said to the folks listening, be prepared for attacks on Canada, our history, constitution, character, and future. And while dressed up as a rational debate, it's highly emotional and manipulative. It's rooted in just enough facts to be credible, but beware of the paranoia, conspiracy theories, and covert power plays. In our volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous times, these kinds of things are possible. So that was my warning, and that presentation is up on YouTube if you're interested. These are now the players that are bringing us up to date. The present Premier of Alberta, who announced her cabinet today. I haven't heard the announcement, so I don't know, but we do know that it will be more rural. The past Premier of Alberta, who we thought was the bottom of the barrel, but things can always get worse. The book edited by Jack Mintz, Ted Morton, and Tom Flanagan, the three key people in the Calgary School, who basically have put together the texts of a conference done in January 2020 in Calgary called The Value of Alberta, but in which a lot of these ideas were road tested and argued. I was one of 600 people who spent a Saturday listening to it. Of course, there are other participants. Poilievre, those of you in Ottawa know him better than I do, although he came out of Calgary but now is in Nepean. When I was in Ottawa, I lived in Nepean. I'm glad to have escaped before he arrived. And of course, Francois Legault has long known that sovereignty as such is off the table in Quebec. There'll never be another referendum. But that if he plays his cards right, he can convince Canadians to let Quebec be a nation within a nation and have all the advantages of sovereignty with none of the disadvantages of being an independent nation. And Scott Moe has now decided to get into this. And last week, released a book. So this is when I think of Canada's brand of conservative populism, this is what I'm thinking of. And so the questions are, what's going on here? Is it just political fluff? And there are some people who say that it is. There's nothing really here to see, just move on. That's very much a minority view. As I make it out, the majority view, including the majority in the press, interestingly enough, are taking the line that the American press took to Trump. And that was that it's all a bit strange, but there's no harm here. That provincial politicians have often argued with Ottawa, and it's natural for them to fight and get a bit huffy, but there's nothing really unusual. And I find that a bit alarming because many in the American press, since Trump retired, well, he hasn't really retired, but since he's out of office, have really come to the view that they facilitated his emergence by not doing their job as a press. And I see that same thing going on in Canada. Or is it the case that these are symptoms that something has gone wrong, which are the first 4 words that Alec Corey spoke in 1973? And if something has gone wrong, what is it? And is it dangerous to Canadians in Canada? And just how so, and how might we cope? So the way I'll proceed is this, that in foresight, as you know, context is king. You don't zero in on things and get down to them. You stand back and look in the broadest context you can. And so I'll review the profound contextual changes in Canadian society and economy since the Second World War. I'll define generic populism and note the quite different characteristics of prairie populism of the early 20th century to types of conservative populism which we see today. And I'll suggest that each of these types could only have emerged in the historical context in which, in fact, they did emerge. I'll explore what I see to be the characteristics of conservative populism. I'll explore the ways I see conservative populism to be dangerous. And I'll note the characteristics of the leadership our situation now calls for. And of course, we will engage. Now, in our organization, as long as there's a twinkle in your eye, rude remarks are in order. So we'll get to that. So changes in Canada's strategic background conditions. That phrase, strategic background conditions, is a phrase that we use in Foresight Canada. What we're trying to get at is that these are the kinds of conditions that typically are taken for granted as just part of the furniture, but they're also the conditions that when they change, they're far more profound changes than the kind of trends that most people do in trend analysis. And if they change enough, it actually changes the trajectory of the corporation or the organization or a whole country or a culture. So in that sense, they're strategic. And so this is not necessarily a complete list. It's somewhat idiosyncratic. I'm not going to go over all of them, for which you'll be thankful, but cast your eyes over these. What I've tried to get at here is kind of a Gestalt pastiche that together they convey a sense of the times after the war, including the fact that we neglected the folks who were invisible to us. That during that time, if you were gay or colored or indigenous, you didn't get much attention, but pretty much the back of our hand. So this was a time that of a largely successful, if somewhat unconscious and somewhat boring, modern techno-industrial culture that was Canada. But by and large, it worked. And so I want you to notice that by and large, inherited knowledge structures and routines worked reasonably well. In other words, the strategy of improving what we had was basically not a bad strategy. That all major institutions were still of a human scale with a human flavor. You were known by name and reputation, which is important. That by and large, one's character made up for a lack of education. And that's important because it meant that people who didn't have the advantage of parents who were educated and who read and therefore didn't grow up with books, that if they were of a good character, they could get on with an organization and because of their character, work their way up. That's typical, for example, of the Canadian banks. It was 1970 before any president and CEO of a Canadian bank had a university education. Up to then, every president had started after high school or even with grade 10 and worked their way up in the bank. So this is a world that even people who today would be greatly disadvantaged could succeed in. And by and large, institution leaders could cope with the challenges that they faced. So it's a place with a reasonably deep order and stability, and persons with agency could actually cope. What I've done here is take those characteristics and put in red and put a line through them, those that in my view no longer hold. And just to look at that conveys the impression that much has changed in terms of the fundamental background conditions of our culture. I'll point out just a couple of things. One is that the aspiration to improve today's world, that is to create a future that's a better version of today, that is still the dominant dream that drives not only Canada, but by and large the OECD world. We talk about major problems like climate change, but the assumption is they can be fixed and fit into a better version of today's world, mostly through technology. It's also the case that when I was a kid, money was on a side altar. God and the source of the sacred were on the main altar. It's not that money wasn't important. As I say, it was on a side altar. But in my lifetime, money has taken over the high altar of our culture. There's almost nothing that we will not now price and sacrifice if the price is high enough. And it's harder to work your way up the ladder. Still possible to do that, but it sure helps if you have a PhD to start. So that here then is even in those things that I've been noticing, there are changes. And these are really quite profound changes. For example, trust increasingly is no longer presumed and given. Distrust and suspicion is becoming normal, even in quite small local levels. The town of Canmore is being sued by one of its developers, and it's not the first town to be sued, but that wasn't common in the 50s or 60s. And of course, we had climate disruption, China, an increasingly uncertain future, and you can add your own pet things to that. So we've gone from a reasonable order and stability where persons with agency could cope and the world basically worked for you, to a world of deepening instability, much harder to cope, and statistically, fewer are managing to do so. That is, the percentage of the society that is hard up against it is growing, that the middle class is being split, roughly 2/3, 1/3. 2/3 are falling in their status and 1/3 increasing. So my overall point at this, just to set this up, is the conditions in Canada today are ripe for a bogus populism. Change has been profound, times are tough, there's no silver bullets. Those who are most distressed by these conditions are those who are economically in precarious positions and those with inadequate education. So these are the people who are easiest to pick on. Morally corrupt leaders can use these folks as peons in their army by riling them up, acknowledging their plight, saying that they, the leaders, care about them, and blaming all of the troubles on some external group, on them. And of course, that's what conservative populism is all about. So let's think about populism. This is the Canadian Encyclopedia definition. All populists claim to speak on behalf of ordinary people who have been let down in some way by an elite establishment, of course, depending on how you flanks.
Stages.
Yeah.
Different
stages from way past. Yeah.
Could you mute everybody? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just going to do that. Just trying to get the right mouse.
He looks
Yeah.
like Lloyd.
Yeah, these guys are, Cordell is very famous.
I want to contrast the prairie populism of the late 1800s, by the time it got into Canada, and the early 20th century,
What?
driven by citizens in communities who wanted more attention and respect for citizens in communities. They were predominantly rural. They created cooperatives. They contended with established elites with private capital. The banks and the railroads. If you grew up in Western Canada, when I did, by the time you were 10, you had learned the phrase, God damn the CPR. So that sense of that folks with power and money were taking advantage of us was real. The allies of these people were actually governments, because governments were then big enough to influence the behavior of private capital. And their own organizations were mostly small and local. Here are some of the ways that showed up in real life. Some of these bodies still around. For those of you who don't know, the first draft of the manifesto of the CCF was actually written in Calgary in 1931. It was revised and accepted in Regina in 1932. So it's known as the Regina Manifesto, but the first version was written in the city I was born in. So there are tensions in prairie populism, but there's a lot going for it. The bits in blue are conditions that make it easier for these folks to function together. That they had similar background experiences. That didn't mean they were from similar cultures, but the background experiences, particularly of being on the prairies when they were similar, and therefore that induced similar sensibilities and values, similar ambitions and goals. Yes, there were differences about the depth of change required, and differences about the pace of change required, and of course normal human differences. But by and large, they were set up that unless you were very difficult indeed, a group could probably function. So let's now think about conservative populism. This is a generic form of it. It applies in Canada, the US, to some extent in Britain, no doubt other places. Driven by financial elites with capital and property, who claim to care about citizens who resent our cosmopolitan world. That's the world that we've become increasingly over the last 50 to 60 years. Both of these folks, both of these groups of people have a vested interest in holding on to the ordered and stable world of the mid-20th century. So the aspiration is to create space for economic enterprise with as few restraints as possible, and to live in a society, and some say with many social personal constraints. These are particularly people who are social conservatives, who want an ordered society by rule and regulation. Increasingly today, there's still a minority voice, but Danielle Smith is one of them. There are libertarians who want not only fewer economic restraints, but fewer personal restraints. And these folks contend with activist governments. It's not an accident that these people argue for small and ineffective governments, and they argue against social progressives. And some of the very rich, some corporations, some private capital are aligned with social conservatives. And they're well organized at every scale. So the fundamental difference that is really worth noting is that these people also, with their roots in the 1950s, the difference is that to the extent they succeed, part of the group that's driving this, namely the financial elite, are actually making more money. And so it's worthwhile for the financial elite as just an investment to put up money to hire, to create organizations, to create journals, to buy radio stations, later television stations, to hire staff. And so these people are organized locally, at state levels, at national levels. And that's true in Canada, that conservative populism in Canada has local, provincial, and national organizations that are far more substantial than the kind of community populism And here are some of the folks. Some of them are Alberta-based. The Fraser Institute is not, although it was initially funded by an Albertan. But there are tensions within conservative populism. That yes, they agree that an ordered liberty, which is one of the phrases now in use, is the goal. But these are folks with very different background experiences, different sensibilities and values, different ambitions, objectives, differences about the depth of change required, differences about the pace of change, as well as normal human differences. And the point is that to actually have this work is just a heck of a lot more work, which is why it's not an accident that the funding for these folks is at least 100 to 1 compared to the funding for community-oriented populism. It may well be more than that. I don't know anybody who's ever done a formal study that's a comparative study. I mean, in the US, for example, it couldn't happen in Canada in quite the same way. But in Canada, for example, where you can own newspapers, there is no national newspaper that fundamentally backs a community populism. The Toronto Star is the last major paper, and as you know, it's in the process of possibly being destroyed because of the disagreement between its two partners. So the characteristics of populism, conservative populism that I see include, they're built on that evolving background of conditions in post-war Canada, a Canada that's increasingly cosmopolitan and therefore turns its back on folks who aren't doing as well, and particularly rural Canada. It's true that the West was colonized by the East in the early years, and but it's also the case that the Canada, Western Canada I grew up in, that wasn't a major point of contention. That most of those struggles had been let go of, and it's only in the last 30 years that the emergence of new conservative populism has blown fresh air and saying, we got to remember, it's the same way as Quebec puts on its license plates, we must remember that we were a conquered people and never forgive them. That this sense in the West is now being blown on again and refreshed, much to the disgust of actually many in the West. But conservative
Ruben, just to transliterate your French, it's to not forget.
Yes.
Yes, is the end.
But what you're not forgetting is, in fact, the conquest.
Yes.
And the fact that our life is at risk by them. Conservative populism in the US has had a significant effect on Canadian conservative populism. I want to just draw your attention briefly to the American South. And by that, I mean literally the South as in the Civil War. Because at the time of the Civil War, the North and the South were on fundamentally different paths. The North was increasingly modern. It was on a path towards a cosmopolitan world. It was using steel. It had heavy industry. The South was still a largely agricultural culture with slavery. And the claims of the South were, we in the South care about the United States of America every bit as much as you in the North do. We are as committed Americans as you are, and we want to be part of this great enterprise, but you should respect us. You should respect us as you respect other people, and part of that respect is to let us have our culture, let us have our way of life, let us have our economy, and let us develop in the way that we want. And if you respect us, we can be one people. And if in that kind of a case, you're not hearing echoes of what now some conservative populist leaders are saying about particularly Alberta and Saskatchewan, you're not paying attention. You also hear it in from some of the things coming out of Quebec. American cattlemen were important because southern Alberta is so dry that relatively little of it can be farmed. Cattle is a major industry. You can't drive cattle from Ontario to Alberta, but you can from Texas or Oklahoma or Colorado. And so the first cattle arrived on cattle drives with Americans. And so to this day, southern Alberta is the most American part of Canada. The Republican Party is not that of Lincoln in 1861, but that of Richard Nixon in the 1950s, when his Southern strategy was to say to the Dixiecrats, Democrats who were still in favor of segregation, to say, abandon the Democratic Party and become Republicans, and we'll support you. And so that sense of the South getting a foothold in the Republican Party. And remember, the old Republican Party was old money from New England. So you're getting a marriage of some folks with old money and serious money with folks holding on to the past, both in their own way, which helps feed into the conservative populism that you see in the US today. I've mentioned the American right. It's worth looking at their history and the extraordinary intentionality behind its leaders and the hundreds of millions that were invested quite deliberately over 50 years to become the powerhouse that they are. American oilmen, I've mentioned, and American education and scholars maps onto particularly the Calgary School. If you haven't heard of the Calgary School, it's a group of people who are economists and political scientists at the University of Calgary. They formed as a group in the early 1990s, late 80s, and deliberately formed as a conservative voice in what they saw to be a left-leaning academy and a left-leaning country. And so these are people, and if you look at them, they're either Americans who moved here at a time we were expanding our institutions, or Canadians who did their graduate work in the US. And I'll say more about them in a minute. And so under these conditions, there's a kind of a twisted story of southern Alberta and its wealth and narcissism. And I'll come to that, but first I want to just say a word about the actual story of southern Alberta. I've mentioned that there aren't many beavers south of the Battleford River, which is about half an hour's drive north of Red Deer, about halfway to Edmonton. So that marks the end of the prairies in Alberta, and it marks the part of Alberta further south that is more open to the kind of populism that you now see. It's not an accident that the United Conservative Party does not do well in Edmonton. It means that Alberta was late entrants to the modern techno-industrial world, that settlers didn't really arrive in any numbers till the 1880s and 1890s, and even through to 1911. 3 million people came to the Canadian prairies during that time, 1 million of them from the US. But it meant that the society that we were creating was a society that had a leg up on a cosmopolitan world. That if you think about it, people lived in Ontario and Quebec for a couple of hundred years before there were any universities. Alberta was not, it was 12 years old, was less than 10 years old when the University of Alberta was formed. And the colonization, which conservative populists talk about with such disgust, also included the Dominion Survey of the 1860s, the Northwest Mounted Police of the 1870s, and Treaty 6 and 7 of the 1870s, which meant that one of the gifts of Ottawa to Western Canada was the peace, order, and good government that is partly defines Canada. so that people who came here didn't have to kill each other over whether you were homesteading my land, because that land had been surveyed and staked. I've mentioned the American influence. Alberta went bankrupt in 1937. That in the early years, from 1905 through to the end of the war, Saskatchewan was actually had a bigger population and a larger economy than Alberta. If you had money to invest, the advice was put it in Saskatchewan, and say Alberta was bankrupt in 1937, 2 years before I was born. And there were some real slights. In other words, there were some real issues that if you want to talk about them, Edmonton was chosen as the capital of Alberta by the Liberal Party. Now, why would that map onto conservative populism? That looks like a provincial issue. Well, the fact is that people in Calgary, and I say this as one born there, have long had the sense that they were the rightful capital of Alberta and have never forgiven the Liberal government for making Edmonton the capital, and act to this day as if Alberta should behave in ways that they decide. It's not an accident that the oil and gas companies are headquartered in Alberta, although the people who actually do the work on the ground are in central and northern Alberta. The natural resources, which by the BNA Act rightfully belong to the provinces, were held by Ottawa until 1930. That was obviously a grave error in judgment, as well as an ethical offense and an economic hardship. That is thrown up in our faces. It's one of the things that is talked about to rile up Albertans today. The fact that the acts passed in 1937 were legally ultra vires, and the Supreme Court should have declared them that way, and they did. But Albertans treat it as saying we were in a difficult position and we were inventive in ways that would have helped us, and you got in our way. And if you listen to Albertans, that sense of we want to do something and you keep getting in our way is one of the most dominant themes in the provincial versions. And of course, the national energy program of Pierre Trudeau, 1980 to 85, people out here only remember the hardship, and the hardship was real, and we can talk about that if you want. They never asked the question of what was the motivation of why it was done. They assumed the motivation was greed in Ottawa and just an attack on Alberta. I won't go further than that. We can explore it if you want. But the point is that when people get testy, there's no interest in a conversation that actually widens the conversation or provides any data that would counter their story. And it's the case that Alberta has been the richest place in Canada for 5 or 6 decades now. This is StatsCan data from 81, 2005, 2016. The darker blue means that you're at the richer end of the spectrum. There's only one dark blue place in Canada over that 40-year period. And you can see that the per capita income in Alberta is 2 or 3 times that of the lowest place in Canada, which is typically New Brunswick. And I can assure you that Albertans give no thought to the fact that for 50 years, we have happily attracted some of the best nurses, teachers, doctors, professors, public servants from poorer places in Canada and attracted them to Alberta. Jason Kenney, in his present program that is still running of Alberta is Calling, there is no discussion in Alberta of the fact of the harm that we have done, particularly to the poorer provinces in Canada, by simply attracting away their best. That will come back in a minute. So the story is told by conservative populists is Alberta is an exceptional place with exceptional people and an exceptional future. That maps on to the kind of American exceptionalism, and in both cases, that kind of ego-filled stance gets you in trouble. But the claim is that Alberta has always been oppressed by Ottawa, always, no exceptions. And the Eastern elites, now defined as the Laurentian elites, which is actually a new classification, never specifying who they are, not recognizing that the end of the Laurentians, at least at the south end, actually ends up in the Gaspé, which is among the poorest places in Canada. The elites there haven't done much to oppress Alberta. Trust me, my wife is from there. They want to be recognized as an equal partner. They're offended that Alberta is not recognized as an equal partner in Confederation. Equal to whom? Equal to Ontario or Quebec? Well, clearly we're not in population or history. To be equal to the federal government is absurd. That's never defined. It's just taken as it's obvious that we're not, and we should be offended. We're offended that we're not acknowledged as a distinct cultural region. Danielle Smith is not the first and not the only leader in Alberta who talks of Alberta as a nation within a nation. Now, one can kind of understand why Quebec does that, and certainly more so why Indigenous people would do that. But Alberta, for goodness sake, give me a break. And the evidence they appeal to includes the fact that Buffalo was rejected by the Liberal government in 1905 when Alberta and Saskatchewan were carved out of the Northwest Territories. Buffalo was a proposal by Haltain, who was the commissioner of the Northwest Territories at the time, who wanted a single province that would include what are now Alberta and Quebec. The interesting thing is the people in Alberta actually argued against it. That fact is not acknowledged by Albertans today because the capital was going to be Regina. And so Calgary and Edmonton certainly didn't want that to happen because they knew one of them would be the capital of a new Alberta. And I've mentioned the things in yellow. I won't go over that. The Senate, as you know, the Reform Party and the Triple E Senate, we only have 6 seats in Alberta, whereas New Brunswick has 10, and that just on the face of it looks unequal. Except the Senate, as you know, was never meant to be representation by population. It wasn't even meant to be representation in a narrow sense by province. It was more by region. And the 4 regions were Atlantic Canada, Quebec, Ontario, and the West, and they each have 24 members in the Senate. And given 1867, that's pretty equal. But of course, that's never talked about in Alberta. The House of Commons is clearly not rep by pop. That people point out that there are some ridings in Atlantic Canada that have 20% of the number of people that the largest ridings in Alberta do. And they talk about taxation without representation, which, interesting enough, comes out of an American concern. In fact, there have been pieces written by members of the Calgary School, op-ed pieces, saying that Alberta needs its own Tea Party, as if the Boston Tea Party has anything to do with Canadian history. There's a sense people are incensed that somehow we pay for Quebec's equalization, and Quebec doesn't even have the decency that they've been paid for to be bought and then to behave, that they disregard us, that they should, if they take our money, they should at least let us have our way with oil pipelines across Quebec. And of course, there's Bill 69, that's the No More Pipelines bill, as known out here. Guns, bilingual, the National Energy Program, that should be UNDP. That's the United Nations statement about Indigenous peoples. And so the elements of the drama are really clear, that the claim is that Albertans are alienated, that they're so alienated that Canada has to take this seriously and change, or they will leave, at least psychologically, as much as the Constitution allows legally, or literally by separating. And the thing that for me is so interesting about this is that the press in Canada and other political parties. So the interesting thing is, it's in the interest of the Conservative Party of Canada to swallow the line that Albertans are alienated. I would argue, if you actually engage Albertans in conversation, that it's a minority of Albertans who are alienated. It's not even a majority. And that the press keep talking about this because the press likes conflict. But what we're creating is an actual condition out of an artificial condition, and that's to corrupt people. So here we have an editorial cartoon that was written just a few days after Jason Kenney became premier. Here we have a book by the Calgary School, Jack Mintz, Ted Morton, Tom Flanagan, all at the University of Calgary. This book contains the text of the speeches of a conference in Calgary in January 2020, at which 600 people gathered and at which this stuff was laid out. And Danielle Smith was the master of ceremonies. And the claim is that Alberta's at a crossroads. The situation in Canada, in Confederation, is unfair. It's unequal. So what comes next? This is part of Jack Mintz's statement at that event. It's just a capture of the screenshot. Political strategies of my generation, that's Jack's generation, the West wants in, did not work. It would be a disservice to the next generation to say otherwise. Therefore, we're more vulnerable to the Liberals' tried and true strategy of pillaging Alberta's economy to buy votes in Ontario and Quebec. And it's taken as gospel truth by these people that that is an accurate reading of Canadian politics. And so it's time for Plan B. And this creates then all kinds of groups who have enough money, and there's lots of money for this from small oil companies, because small oil companies tend to be run by small families who are conservative minded, not just politically, but small c conservative minded, and therefore you can always get money for these kinds of things. And these are the numbers that our particular people appeal to. They point out the $611 billion since 1961 has gone from Alberta to Ottawa. That's $611 billion more than has come back to Alberta. So that Alberta's net contribution to Canada is $611 billion, and that somehow, if we were independent, we would have kept all that. What's more, 476 of that went straight to Quebec, as if Alberta is writing checks for Quebec's equalization. Now, Jason Kenney was part of the cabinet that wrote the present rules about equalization, and he knows better. But in fact, he got Albertans riled up with a referendum that literally asked the question, should equalization be in the Canadian Constitution, yes or no? And that referendum was passed, not by a great majority. I think it was 58%. It may have been slightly more than that, but it wasn't huge. But as if, in effect, saying to Albertans what is a patent lie, that Alberta is directly funding Quebec's equalization. That's not the way it works. And of course, we've got it down to how much a minute this prompted another group, Fairness Alberta, to run a meter that literally was on the web with how much each Albertans were contributing from January 1st, 2007. This is till the end of December 2019, as if in fact we would each have that in our pockets. This kind of thing, the source is Statistics Canada, printed in the National Post, no friend of the Liberal Party, showing that over this period of time, 3 provinces had been wealthy enough to help Canada function. And the complaint in Alberta is that by looking at that chart, you should be offended. As opposed by looking at it, you should say, isn't that great? That's how families are supposed to work. That, in fact, is how a cooperative arrangement is supposed to work. that those who have contribute to those who have not, to make sure that none are left behind. This is numbers before the federal government bought the Trans Mountain Pipeline, claiming that without that pipeline, Canada was losing $80 million every day, that because we couldn't sell Alberta's oil on an open market. So how do I see this to be dangerous? 7 ways. Conservative populists appear to still live in a realist world where there is a they that are the enemy. But remember, in the realist world of the First Enlightenment, the objective world is out there, and we know it by our rational minds, but our emotional response to it makes no difference to that real world. And so this means that truth and reality aren't affected by getting all head up about it. So there's no harm done in riling people up for political purposes. In other words, our responsibility is to know what is true, and if people don't know what is true, you have the right to tell them. So there's this funny combination of playing fast and loose with reality and claiming our truth is real and you must listen. And so what it does is, this is a form of Manichaeism, which, if you know your Christian church history, was declared to be a heresy by the Christian church in the 3rd century. Stephen Harper was the first Canadian prime minister to talk in a way that is at all Manichaeistic. But it divides the world into those who are good and those, not just us and them, but they are evil and we are good. And therefore there is no harm done. In fact, we are justified in destroying those who are against us. And what they don't get is that the epistemology over the last 70 years has moved that we are now in a construable and constructivist universe. And therefore, what the stories that we tell each other affect the social realities that we create together. And the human actions of all kinds alter reality and truth for other human beings. And that leaders bear a responsibility for shaping the sensibilities of their followers. We all know that as parents. We have a responsibility to shape the sensibility of our kids. If our kids delight in pulling wings off flies, we try to help teach them to be empathetic even to the flies, and that delight should be taken in roses and other kinds of things, but not pulling wings off flies. Conservative folks appear to be blind to the responsibilities of leadership in a co-creative world. This is that leaders really shape the sensibilities of their followers, that they signal where the lines are that can and cannot be crossed. And it's not okay to rile folks up and egg them on, and then when they cross lines that ought not to be crossed, to deny any responsibility for their conduct. That's Jason Kenney. Kenney spent 16 months seeking the leadership of first the Progressive Conservative Party and then the United Conservative Party. 16 months traveling Alberta, put 500,000 kilometers on his big blue truck, convincing his talk was entirely to rile Albertans up, that we were not getting a fair deal in Confederation. So it was entirely a conservative populist line. And once he was premier, he put together a fair deal panel that held hearings throughout the province. And I was at 2 of those 6 hearings, and they were appalling. They were literally events that simply encouraged, sponsored by the government of Alberta, that encouraged the worst of these people to express the worst and to shout down anyone who wanted to speak in any way in favor of Canada, and such people were shouted down. As I mentioned, he had a referendum on equalization, as if that makes any difference, as if an Alberta attitude on federal legislation is anything other than a political stunt. He created an energy war room that greenwashes Alberta's oil and gas industry to this day. $5 million a year, he created it as an independent corporation with independent to pretend that this is independent, although the government funds it. So it's not accountable to the Auditor General. It's not accountable to the legislature. It's not accountable, as far as we can see, to be anybody except the Premier, who appointed their directors. And he created a Royal Commission into foreign funding of anti-oil interests, that is, environmental interests. And Steve spent 2 years, $3.5 million, and his report basically says, I'm sorry, Mr. Premier, it's not happening. What you claimed was true is simply not true. And remember that Danielle Smith has spent the last 3 years on talk radio with people who are themselves inclined to, if they're not already riled up, to become riled up. Enough that she's convinced herself that these are a majority of Albertans, and she's deliberately putting together a coalition that is explicitly rural Alberta, which has 41 seats. The UCP now has 39 of those 41 seats. If she can get all rural Alberta, all she needs is 3 urban seats, just 3, any place in Canada, any place in Alberta, and she will form the government. And she's not ashamed to do this, to simply say, we are right, these other people who disagree with us are wrong and evil. They appear to be blind to the morally corrosive nature of what they're doing. They're nurturing narcissism, self-pity, resentment, anger, desire for revenge, never forget, never forgive, immaturity, self-justification, ignorance. It's okay to work yourself up into a snit. Reject all insights which lead to owning any responsibility for the situation. Double down, never apologize, and be willfully blind. The picture that you see was taken by my wife in 2020. If that said, honk even if you hate Ontario, the police would be on it. If it said honk if you hate the Jews, there'd be all kinds of people on it. But somehow in Alberta, it's legitimate to hate and openly hate Justin and his father and Ottawa. Conservative populism is blind to the profound ways the world is changing and the ways they are locking Alberta, and if they have their way, Canada, into yesterday's future and yesterday's aspirations. That is, Alberta as a high carbon energy, free market, neoliberal holdout. Alberta as a refuge for persons, companies, and capital that are also such holdouts. Alberta as a place where we can define the future, and the future we define is high carbon energy, free market, neoliberal. The picture is from the Business Council of Alberta, which is overwhelmingly male. Understandably, it's the major CEOs in Alberta, although it's chaired by a female. And Alberta is still hierarchical, patriarchal, measuring the good life. And if you look at their report, the good life is essentially a continuation of the Alberta we knew during boom times, which is very much an Alberta that is committed to a world that slowly we're learning has no long-term future. These people at least had the integrity to ask Janet Brown, who's an extraordinary pollster of Alberta politics and other things in Calgary, to say, how do others see us? And as you can see, what Albertans think is that Alberta is well positioned for the economy of the future. People are comfortable living in Alberta, that we're welcoming and Albertans care about others, and that we care about climate change. But in fact, what others say about us is, yes, we may be well positioned for the economy of the future, but half of Canadians would not be comfortable living in Alberta. Half. That means half the people who look at Jason Kenney's Alberta is Calling feel some kind of resentment to Alberta that we have the money and we're acting in a way that is damaging to Canada, and we don't give a damn. That we're not a welcoming place and we don't care about climate change. They appear to be blind to the way that they're corrupting others. This is the point that, in fact, when you set the tone of something, you're providing legitimacy for the attitudes expressed. Here you see on the right-hand side, the people who were candidates for the leadership of the UCP. When that run started, Danielle Smith talked about sovereignty for Alberta and was the only firebrand in terms of this kind of populism. Yes, Brian Jeans was there, and he talked about it in a somewhat more reasonable way. But by the time this was over, every candidate was dismissing Ottawa and talking about Ottawa in a manner that most of them would not have touched. In other words, the pressure to simply say, this is what the party wants and this is what we must give them. And so it's dangerous to get people head up in a way that's not justified, because if you sustain it long enough, you can actually create the conditions that you then were talking about. And I suggest to you that both Francois Legault and the Premier of Saskatchewan will use Alberta sometime in the next 10 years to justify what they are doing. When they're called on it by the press, they'll say, well, Alberta's been doing it, so it must be all right, eh? So finally, we're blind to our responsibilities to Canada and other fellow Canadians. This is the famous firewall letter that was signed by Stephen Harper, the Calgary School. And you see the Mavericks vision there, protecting our priorities and way of life from federal overreach. This is back to setting Alberta up as the new South, that it may well come to a civil war in Canada, because it's quite clear that these people are saying that if you should respect us and let us have our culture, which is distinctive, you've done it with Quebec, do it with us, let us have our economy and let us develop it in our own way. And it happens to be a high carbon economy, and we want to develop it faster without regard to climate change. And we have the right to do that. And if you won't let us do it, we'll leave. This is more recent data from 338 Canada. And what you see is that other than people who vote Conservative, there's a consensus we should be doing more about climate change. People who vote Conservative, not. This is the question of, does climate change pose a real threat? 90% of people who don't vote Conservative saying yes, 41% of people who do. We are nurturing a group of people who will become a hard-edge, right-wing, anti-democratic group in the same way as you find in the United States. And that's my fear, which is why I'm speaking out now. So what has gone wrong? That what has gone wrong is that while our world has changed, there should be an R there, Canada's official dream is still the same. We can improve and extend our modern techno-industrial cultures forever. And the inability to deliver on that dream sets us up for the kind of populism which is corrupting us and diminishing our future. What we need are elites who will own up to the actual conditions we face. Now, that's not news to any of you on this cast. So the leadership we need are persons in communities with a non-trivial understanding of how history actually works, and that this requires adequate mental models of how history adequately works. And we don't have those kind of leaders today. Such understanding enables an utterly fresh understanding of our actual situation in history. its dimensions, drivers, dynamics, depths, drifts, and dilemmas. And we would get a more honest conversation about these things. And as you know, we don't have it. Such persons will have the capacity to know what is real, see what needs to be done, think and feel their way through it enough to be able to get it done without having to be told what to know, see, think, or do. That's an extraordinarily high standard, but it's what we need at a time when we're caught in a time of historical change, that we have to learn to give up on the modern techno-industrial dream and hip check Canada and the Western world onto a fundamentally different trajectory. So I implore you to prepare for and participate in the coming intensification in the struggle for our future. If you think the truckers are just no more than a foretaste of what is to come over this decade, your presence and participation matters. Thank you. Over to you. The future is in our hands, hearts, minds, and spirits.